When you imagine Sleeping Beauty, you probably think of a rather gentle fairy tale, one that ends neatly with a simple kiss. But the story most of us know, well, it's a polished version of something much older and, frankly, much darker. Today, we're exploring the 1858 text, a version with a shocking second act that was considered far too grim for modern tastes. So, let's pull back the curtain on the tale you only thought you knew.
Our story begins not with joy, but with this profound sense of royal desperation. Vows, pilgrimages, every remedy imaginable was tried, but nothing worked. Then, at long last, the queen gives birth to a daughter, and the entire kingdom prepares for a christening of truly unparalleled splendor.
So, for the princess's christening, the king and queen invited all the fairies they could find in the land, 7 in total, to serve as godmothers. The custom, you see, was for each to bestow a magical gift, essentially guaranteeing a life of perfection. A grand banquet was prepared, complete with magnificent, solid gold place settings for each of the 7 fairies. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Well, just as the guests are taking their seats, an 8th fairy enters the hall. She's much, much older, and no one had invited her because she hadn't left her tower in half a century and was widely believed to be dead or enchanted. The king scrambles to set a place for her, but he can't produce a solid gold case like the others had. The old fairy immediately takes this as a slight, a deep insult, and she begins to mutter threats between her teeth. The younger fairies, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing, began to present their gifts. The princess was to be the most beautiful person in the world. She would possess the mind of an angel, have the most admirable grace. She'd dance perfectly, sing like a nightingale, and master every musical instrument. They were literally gifting her a perfect life. But one very clever young fairy, overhearing the old one's grumbling, decides to hold her gift back, just in case.
And then, it was the old fairy's turn. Her head shaking more with malice than with age, she declares her terrible gift, that one day the princess would pierce her hand with a spindle and die from the wound. A tremor of horror just rips through the hall. The celebration is shattered.
But just as all hope seems lost, that young fairy who had cleverly held back her gift steps forward. "Comfort yourselves, king and queen, your daughter shall not die." Now, she doesn't have the power to completely undo her elder's powerful curse, but she can alter it. The princess will still pierce her hand, but instead of death, she will fall into a deep slumber for 100 years, to be awakened at last by a king's son.
The king, desperate to cheat fate, immediately issues a royal edict. Anyone found spinning with the spindle, or even possessing one, would be put to death. But, of course, prophecies have a stubborn way of coming true. 15 years later, the princess, now a curious young woman, is exploring the castle and stumbles upon a small room at the very top of a tower. And there sits an honest old woman, completely unaware of the king's decree, spinning with her distaff. You see, this old woman had never even heard of the king's prohibition. "What are you doing?" the princess asks, utterly fascinated by this strange new object. She eagerly takes the spindle to try it for herself. But being hasty and a little thoughtless, just as the fairies had ordained, she pierces her hand with the point and faints away. The curse is fulfilled.
The good fairy, leagues away, is instantly alerted by her dwarf who wears 7-league boots. She arrives in a fiery chariot, and with incredible foresight, she realizes the princess would be absolutely terrified to wake up a century later completely alone. So she touches everyone and everything in the palace with her wand. Governesses, guards, cooks, horses, even the princess's tiny dog Pusti. They all fall into a deep sleep, fated to wake only when their mistress does.
The king and queen depart, leaving their daughter to her enchanted rest, and in just a quarter of an hour, a dense forest of trees, brambles, and thorns grows up around the castle, so thick and so tangled that no living thing can pass. For a full century, all that can be seen from the outside world are the very tops of the castle towers. The world, it's simply forgot.
100 years later, a new king is on the throne from a completely different royal family. His son, a young prince, is out hunting nearby when he spies those mysterious towers rising above the impassable woods. He asks what they are and soon discovers that 100 years of history has decayed into little more than spooky folklore.
The truth, you see, had rotted into rumor. Some of the locals claimed the castle was haunted by ghosts. Others whispered that it was a meeting place for witches to hold their sabbat. But the most common belief? That it was the home of an ogre who snatched up children to eat them at his leisure.
The prince doesn't know what to believe until an old peasant speaks up. "My father told me," he says, "that in that castle lies the most beautiful princess ever seen. She is to sleep for 100 years, to be awakened by a king's son for whom she is reserved." At these words, the prince feels himself all on fire, instantly convinced that he is that son, that he is destined for this glorious adventure.
As he approaches the woods, the massive trees and thorns part for him as if by magic. He walks into the castle courtyard completely alone, where a frightful, deathly silence reigns. He sees bodies of men and animals everywhere, seemingly lifeless, until he notices the flushed, ruddy faces of the guards, a sure sign they're only in a deep, perhaps wine-fueled sleep.
He passes through halls filled with sleeping courtiers and finally enters a room covered with gold. And there, on a bed, he sees her, a princess of about 15 whose beauty is described as being luminous and supernatural. He approaches, trembling with admiration, and kneels beside her.
The moment he kneels, the enchantment breaks. The princess awakens and, looking at him with a surprising tenderness, she speaks those words. The prince is, of course, overjoyed, and in that very instant, the entire palace awakens with them. Things move quickly from there. Supper is announced, and after a hasty meal, the royal almoner marries them in the chapel that very night.
And this is where the story you know ends. But in this 1858 telling, this is where the truly dark part begins. You see, the prince couldn't reveal his marriage. He returned to his father's court, living a double life. In secret, he and the princess had 2 children, a daughter named Aurora and a son named Day.
So why the secrecy? Well, here's the crucial detail. He was terrified of his own mother, the queen. She was, the text tells us, of the race of ogres. It was whispered at court that she had the inclinations of an ogress and that she struggled to restrain herself from pouncing upon little children. It was only when his father died 2 years later that the prince, now king, finally dared to bring his family home.
Soon, the new king must go to war, leaving the kingdom in the hands of his mother, the Ogress Queen Regent. She promptly sends her daughter-in-law and grandchildren to a country house, the better to satisfy her horrible longing. One evening, she says to her maitre d'hotel, the master of her household, "I will eat little Aurora for dinner tomorrow."
The man is horrified, but he's clever. He kills a young lamb instead and serves it with a sauce so delicious it completely fools his mistress. He then hides little Aurora away with his wife. A week later, the wicked queen issues her next command: "I will eat little Day for supper." Again, the maitre d'hotel deceives her, this time with a tender young goat, and hides the boy away with his sister.
But one evening, as the ogress prowls the castle grounds, she overhears little Day crying and Aurora begging for him to stop. Recognizing their voices, she becomes absolutely furious at having been cheated. In a voice that makes the entire court tremble, she gives her final, terrible command.
She orders a massive copper vat to be brought into the court. She has it filled with toads, vipers, adders, and serpents, intending to throw into it the young queen, her children, the maitre d'hotel, and his entire family. They are brought forth, their hands tied behind their backs, ready for execution.
But just as the executioners prepare to act, the king rides into the courtyard. He's returned from war far earlier than anyone expected. Stunned, he demands to know the meaning of this horrific spectacle. The ogress, enraged at seeing her plan foiled, doesn't wait for an answer. She flings herself headfirst into the copper vat and is devoured in an instant by the hideous reptiles she had gathered. The king, we are told, is a little sorry. She was his mother after all, but he is soon consoled by his beautiful wife and children. But the story doesn't end with happily ever after. No, it ends with this cynical, almost jarring piece of verse, a strange and unsettling final thought from a version of a fairy tale that time tried very hard to forget.